What I want to talk about today is part of a forthcoming work on the human rights graphic novel. It will release later this year, and what I'm speaking today is a section of that particular book dealing with novels, graphic novels that are about refugees. A couple of words about this. What I was doing in the book, what I have done in the book is looking at texts from all over the world. So I have got work from India, the United States, Native American writing, Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Vietnam, Japan, and looking at the theme of human rights and human rights violations. And while working on several of these rather traumatic texts, I encountered a bunch of fairly recent graphic novels on the refugee crisis. Olivier Kugler's Escaping Wars and Waves, Encounters with Syrian Refugees, Kate Evans's work on refugees in Greece and other places. It's a kind of episodic one. But also Eoin Colfer's well-known young adult fiction writers, Illegal. But also texts that some of us might be familiar with. Vishwajyoti Ghosh's This Side, That Side, which is a graphic novel on the partition of India, the two partitions, both Bengal and Indo-Pak. So this is part of that particular project, and the focus on vulnerability, precarity is and has been a continuing theme in my work for the last 5 books, more or less like a vulnerability quartet or a vulnerability quintet. I forget now the sequence, but yes, work on Bhopal, on extremes, on human rights and literature. So this continues my concern with precarious lives, vulnerable lives, and things like that. So that is more or less the background. About the refugee graphic novels themselves, these are non-fictional memoirs, biographies, constructed around interviews in many cases with refugees themselves. Olivier Kugler's Escaping Wars and Waves, for instance, interviews about a dozen people in refugee camps, and constructs a narrative around their lives, their past, their present. Kate Evans does the same thing in her work. So these are non-fictional reconstructions of refugee lives, their memories, their nostalgia, the reasons why they fled their quote-unquote homes and moved into quote-unquote new homes, and the events that accompany this process of displacement. Eoin Colfer's Illegal is about very literal metaphor of the boat people, and a lot of the first part of the text is spent on the journey itself. I'm going to begin by sharing a screen image for you to take a look at. Please hold a second. This is from Kugler's work. It's the first page, and of this, it's a fuller page. So I'm going to show you in 2 parts. Yeah. So this is actual dialogue put in quote marks. This is a screen. This is a drawing of a mobile phone screen, and this boy in the corner is actually holding this phone, and it shows the blowing up of homes and residences. This is the image of injured legs after he has been shot at in his house, and the close-up of it. And note the arrangement of the image and the text. Kugler does interesting things. He labels things. So he draws these arrows, he numbers them, he writes little descriptions and captions. That's one. I will share one more for you to. All this takes a little adapting. This is the continuation of that image, the boy holding a phone. And the image you saw last time of the explosion is on his screen, and it is drawn. Now, one of the things we understand about the graphic novel is that the graphic novel presupposes somebody sitting and drawing. It's a very corporeal act of drawing. Somebody sits and draws, unlike print. So there is a very embodied act of production in the writing and drawing and the inking and the coloring of a graphic text. So this is an important point. Hilary Chute makes it in Disaster Drawn and other works. And it's something to keep in mind when we think in terms of the structure of witnessing. It's not the subject of my talk, but I would like you to keep this in mind. Now, what I want to begin with is this narrative strategy in Olivier Kugler's Escaping Wars and Waves, Encounters with Syrian Refugees, where he's at this point, and the two images that I've shown you, is drawing and telling us Wissam's story. Wissam is narrating how he got shot in his house in Syria, an incident that forced them to flee their homeland. And after describing the event on the facing page, Kugler draws Wissam from the waist down. The legs that you just saw are drawn fleshy and marked with bullet injuries. And in case you don't know what they are labeled bullet wounds in a very ekphrastic, realistic mode. The part above the knee is only a swirl of lines and curls. So it's only the leg downwards that you have a focused drawing. The part above the knee is just a kind of messy lines and curls system. One can vaguely discern an arm. One can vaguely discern a head leaning forward and down, as though checking his own legs. And oddly, you see another leg behind Wissam's body. Kugler transforms the flesh and blood Wissam into a quasi-spectral Wissam on the next page. So in the page preceding the one I have shown you, you have Wissam sitting and talking. So there is a full-bodied, corporeal, material, flesh and blood Wissam. And by the time we look at this particular image, he is a quasi-spectral figure, symbolizing a literal lessening of the person by virtue of being a refugee. So that's my first point about this image. There is a lessening, a reduction into a set of lines, rather than the embodied flesh of a realist painting, a drawing, or a photograph. So the reduction is shown in the form of those squiggles and those lines. And unlike a realist painting, which gives you large chunks of fleshy humans, you have actually got here a kind of spectralized, decorporealized, dematerialized image. This reduction or lessening is compounded by the fleshy and injured legs that are also drawn simultaneously. So flesh here is broken up. The person is debodied or spectralized. So Kugler makes sure we understand that vulnerability has been changed into helplessness. All of us, as Adriana Cavararo tells us via a reading of Judith Butler, all of us are vulnerable, but not all of us are helpless. Vulnerability is a condition shared by all humans, but helplessness is a degree higher or worse, as the case may be. So what Kugler is saying, is drawing for us actually, is that vulnerability has been exposed to helplessness, has been converted into helplessness as a consequence of very specific social, political, and legal contexts. Wissam's fleshy feet, as opposed to the spectral remainder of his body, intrude or stand upon a screenshot of a mobile phone, which also you have just seen. The screen shows missiles firing. The screenshot is an expanded image as though it is a blown up shot. And I use the word advisedly because the shot is of something being blown up. And the phone is held by a young boy, with both boy and the phone being drawn, as opposed to the blown up image of the phone, which is actually a photograph. So Wissam's injuries and his corporeal vulnerability, Kugler shows, are literally embedded in the war-torn Syrian soil seen on the phone screen. It symbolizes something much more than corporeal damage, with his feet touching Syrian soil in and on the image of the phone. Kugler shows how Wissam really never left Syria. His injuries are Syrian, his identity will remain Syrian, and embedded in the frame that is Syria, hence the role of the mobile phone's image in the form of the pages. Now, what I want to draw attention to here is that the drawing, the photograph, and even the material structure of the page, the construction of the page, all contribute to this theme of spectral versus corporeal, real versus disappearing. It is in the nature of the text itself, and I am talking about the book, the Refugee book, as a material artifact. So, in the space of just a set of visuals, Kugler moves from ontological injury to situational vulnerability of the boy's growing up years and the process of growing up. The boy is witness to massive destruction and loss. He sees death at close quarters and is scarred for life. So Kugler's text instances other such young boys. There are several such boys. There's a boy who's silent, who never speaks, who's mute because of trauma experienced and witnessed. It's there in Kate Evans's work as well, where there are boys so scarred for life that they don't speak. These are boys who have, since their experience of necro-witnessing, my term for people who witness death at close quarters in large numbers, very often of their own family members, boys who have lapsed into silence. Now, the graphic novel has been extensively examined for its representations of war, violence, genocide, rape, trauma. Hilary Hugh's Disaster Drone, Romero Gerard's The Trauma graphic novel, Harriet Earl's Comics, Trauma and the New Art. And this work that I am talking about, my work on human rights graphic novel, is a part of this tradition. Now, in all of these, they show how the graphic novel functions, if not as an exact equivalent, as a resonant form of photography from the humanitarian projects of the 20th century. That is, it enables, that is the graphic novel, the refugee graphic novel, enables a narration and a visualization of vulnerability, trauma, resilience, and resistance so as to produce a structure of feeling of empathy, sympathy, and politically charged emotions. The refugee graphic novel possesses all these characteristics. I will first talk about the staging of vulnerability in the refugee graphic novel. And I would argue that the refugee graphic novel is akin to the human rights graphic novel because of this particular unrelenting focus on vulnerability and vulnerable bodies and trauma. I'm going to first look at bodies. I'll move on to things later. In Kugler's text, the injured body is positioned in such a way that we believe that Kugler is seeing the injuries himself. As Hilary Shute and others have noted, the artist is present at the scene, and then the artist sits and draws, because the graphic novel is produced by a very clear embodied act of drawing. And in Kugler's text, the injured body is positioned in such a way that we believe, or we are led to believe, that Kugler is seeing the injuries himself. When focusing on the injured body, Kugler is not speculating on the sources or the extent of the injuries, or reconstructing them realistically. This is an authenticating device, which signals Kugler's role, which further testifies to the authenticity of his narrative. In the photograph, which is deemed to be the dominant visual language of witnessing, attests what Roland Barthes will claim or presence, that is, the camera implies that the cameraman was there or set it up there. The drawing adds a further layer to the authentication. Kugler was present when Wissam showed him the injuries. This same Kugler later went back and drew the injuries. How accessibility took notes is a drawn form. Drawing accounts for what it looks like and also for the sensual practice it embeds and makes visible. End of quote. It materializes a history through the work of marks on the page. It creates it as a space and substance, gives it a corporeality, a physical shape. I suggest that in the refugee graphic novel, we find a participatory documentary mode. I'm borrowing this work from Nick Quid's arguments. The subjective element of the making of the documentary is highlighted in the process. That is, the participatory documentary mode is not the distance documentary mode. It documents the subjective element that I was there. And people described it as I was there-ness, as in I was physically present as a witness, and I am recording this. You will see some of this in one of the other books that I have worked on. I got the Ukrainian and Russian notebooks, which is on the Holodomor, the enforced famine in Stalin's time, which produced 6 million deaths in Ukraine. It's the Holodomor, as it's called. The Ukrainians have asked for it to be termed genocide. Russia has so far refused to acknowledge it as genocide. And this participatory documentary mode occurs there as well. Now, in the participatory documentary mode, in the place of truth claims and authenticity claims, the writer-artist foregrounds the affective and the subjective when documenting the refugee state. She or he emphasizes that the document at hand is not merely the testimony of a survivor, but a testimony narrated to the comic book writer and a testimony mediated by this writer. So there's no attempt to give it a very objective, distanced narration. It forces our attention to the fact that the survivor has spoken to the comic book writer, the artist, and this is a testimony mediated by this writer. The refugees' accounts of their ruination back home, the journey to Kos or Calais, their life in the camp, is narrated to the author artist, who then imagines and images a pain that she never experienced when transferring it to the page. In other words, it is a participation as a feeling artist in the stories being told that enables Kugler or Evans to create an idiom, images of tortured, starved, and suffering bodies. Evans's facial expressions that show her emotions when perceiving the state of the refugees is a clue to her role as a feeling artist. Now, Kugler doesn't draw himself, but Kate Evans draws herself. She is the artist who interviews the refugees and draws herself interviewing the refugees. So, Evans's facial expressions that show her emotions when perceiving the state of the refugees is a clue to her role as a feeling artist, an empathic listener who draws the vulnerable body from the deeply unsettling encounters with such bodies. We see such an unsettling encounter in a ghostification of the human form in Kate Evans's Threats from the Refugee Crisis. After the police raid the Calais refugee camp, the refugees lose even their temporary homes. One friend of Kate Evans, Susan Partridge, who runs an art center in the refugee camp, gets the refugees to cheer up by having their body outlines drawn on paper. So what they do is, they lie down on white paper, they draw their outlines. So they sit down, squat, but they are all drawing their bodies and they label them so-and-so's body. The next set of pages shows a very different image. These papers that they have drawn are cut into human shapes and they're hung out to dry. All right, so let me share that particular image for you. This is the image from Kate Evans. So the woman on the right corner at the foot of the page is Kate Evans. She's the artist. And what she's doing is she's showing herself in the midst of those quote-unquote figures. All right? So all the shapes there are paper, bits of paper, in human form. And as she puts it, they have been hung out to dry. It's a double spread, so it's a very stunning kind of image. Now, the point I'm making is the paper cut into human shapes, hung out to dry, as the page's first text box declares, is a crisscrossing set of lines of red tape, not different from festoon paper, but from which these shapes are hung, looking uncanny like human bodies hanging. Some flap around, twisting in the air, and they resemble tortured, twisted bodies. So they are suspended like this, they're twisted, they're bent. They generate a powerful, uncanny effect through the resemblance to and difference from the human, but invoke the human thanks to the text and the plot. So one of the first things you recognize about Eoin's threats from a refugee crisis is that there is a diminishing of the human. There is a progressive reduction or lessening of the human that you can see. And Eoin's use of this particular trope is particularly significant for that reason, because it demonstrates to us that the human who is a refugee has become, is a diminished person, or is perhaps no longer a person. Though the point is not that. The point is that when you say it's a diminished person, you also begin to think that the person is a non-person. So whether refugees are non-person, and you know the technical term, persona non grata, is something you can affix to those bits of paper floating on those festoons. So my first theme about how vulnerability is depicted is in this kind of system or troping of bodies that are being diminished, and the uncanniness of the image of things that look like humans but are not quite human. Okay, the second theme about talking about vulnerability has to do with families. In Threads from a Refugee Crisis, an old man from Afghanistan who never made it to Liverpool waves cheerily, and Kate, most of the children in the camp, we are told, are unaccompanied. A pregnant woman who has lost her husband in Iraq hopes to meet her separated sister one day. An old mother is drawn staring at the photograph of her son, and she sits there looking at it and says, I think of her, this is Kate speaking, I think of her thinking of him every hour of the day. Throughout Kugler's text, the refugees speak of missing their families, both immediate and extended, ever since they left Syria. Many, of course, also wonder if their families are still alive. So through the narratives, there is a constant emphasis on families whose lives have been disrupted, families that are broken. There is one significant point that Kate Evans makes when across 2 pages she draws the human shape plus that I said. And the accompanying text after this says, 129 lone children disappeared from the camp during the evictions. Now what happens is these camps are subject to police raids and children disappear after that. So she writes, 129 lone children disappeared from the camp during the evictions. No one will ever know what happened to them. Events like Kugler has documented those refugees who have left their extended families behind or lost their families on the journey. Here she speaks of those children who have no claimants, no attached families. Now, we understands, and I'm adapting here the work of those who have written on refugees from the sociological perspective. The family is a cultural script and stereotype, which is a well-tested formula in the process when looking at refugees. So the family values, within quotes, ideology that underwrites these representations reads stability, human dignity, and human fulfillment within the structure of the family alone. So one way of drawing attention to the question of vulnerability is to show how this cultural script breaks down. Family as a cultural script, which is central to talking about security and safety, works as a kind of paradigm to which to show that the refugees are vulnerable, and they have been transformed from vulnerable into helpless populations. The use of the family trope in these texts intensifies the representations of loss of belonging and identity, which is also linked to situational vulnerability through traumatic events. The family, it may be recalled, is precisely what is missing or at stake in the traditional Bildungsroman. So in many ways, this is the refugee graphic text is what Joseph Slaughter called a dissential Bildungsroman, or a reversal of the Bildungsroman, where you go from, in the traditional Bildungsroman, as several of you who study literature will know, you move from being a foundling to integration into a social order, where you find your family and you integrate into the social order. The refugee graphic novel shows how you began with a family and you end with not having a family. So it reverses the traditional Bildungsroman. So after bodies and families, my third frame within which to read situational vulnerability is things or objects. In Vishyajyoti Ghosh's collection, This Side, That Side, some of you may know, there are literally dozens of varieties of text from other eras. There are maps, there are stamps, there are postcards, there are official letters, newspapers, passport pictures which show stamps of entry and exit. The text and image bleed into the borders. Bleed, of course, as you know, is a graphic novel term. And in the case of those texts, the text and image bleeding into borders is a little bit like history itself, barely restrained by the material extent of the book. Maria Litwa's lovely little text, Welcome to Geneva Camp, in Vishyajyoti Ghosh's This Side, That Side, is made up of photographs embedded in black pages. The blackness is thick and wide on most of the pages. There are no panels or gutters, just a black page in which these images and texts are embedded. Manli Gupta and Dyuti Mittal's The Taboo, also a story in This Side, That Side, has no borders or panels, and events unfold in shapeless, inky clouds that constitute some sort of quote-unquote world. Now, why am I mentioning this, the kind of page work that is here? It's connected to the point I made very early. In the graphic novel, the material nature of the book is very crucial. People have spoken about the fact that graphic novels have a particular smell to them. The smell of ink, thick black ink. Then there is the structure of the book itself. Heavy, cumbersome because the pages are thick, glossy. The blackness, like in this case, which kind of overwhelms you when you open the book. There's this thick black cloud into which you are actually looking, which also changes the way you read the book. So the graphic novel returns us to the material dimensions of reading a history text, a refugee story. Now, in each of these tales, the absence of panels, and the coterminous nature of the image with the material nature of the page ensures that we are constantly uncomfortable with the viewing position that they suggest. When the historical event is thus represented, as in This Side, That Side, it escapes its spatial temporal box and comes to occupy the entire field of perception. That is, the event is no longer restrained by a box, by the panel, which is the traditional structure of the graphic novel or the comic book. The event is no longer restrained, and the reader can no longer follow a narrative chronology. So you have this page where everything is messed up, put together, blurred. So you don't have a chronological way of reading it. Okay, we start at the top corner and panel 1, panel 2, panel 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9 being the traditional number on a standard size graphic novel. So you can't read it like that for the simple reason that there are no panels. There are no panels. The point I'm making is the very material arrangement of the historical event in the form of text, images, and icons that constitutes the project of consuming history is central to how we understand that history. The arrangements complicate the idea of closure. They keep the process by which readers fill in the gaps between panels and come to an understanding of the whole through an observation of the parts. It becomes impossible to distinguish where the various parts end, given their shared boundaries with other parts. Photographs merge with the present, maps cut across people's faces, bodies occupy maps, letters and documents merge with physiognomies. The material telling of events without borders, clear frames or boxes, forces the reader to address the problem of closure. Further, such a strategy alerts the reader to the impossibility of assigning any definite or fixed meaning to historical events, because it's no longer limited to time and space of the panel or the page. It spreads everywhere. Given their continued existence in people's lives, the remainders and reminders of them in the form of letters or photographs, and the corporeal manifestations of historical tragedy in the form of refugees. We understand when events bleed constantly into the present, that there is no one perspective on the past. Neither is the past entirely past, given the partition's frequent incursions into the lives of the protagonists and their descendants. So this side, that side, disrupts the authority of the historical narrative by offering us troubled and subjective histories, invisible histories, and ellipses, and the complicated modes of employment and attention to the material in the telling. Now, the captions and the data on these photographs acquire a different dimension in Kate Evans. Evans is at the site when the French police come to the camp. Now, what happens in Kate Evans' text is the French police raid a refugee camp. They arrive at the door of a single mother and her twins. She pleads with the people not to photograph her children. The police slap her and they photograph all of them. The idea is that they are documenting the refugees to have a database of refugees. Evans draws the photographs that the police took, complete with the captions and data they would have entered on these pictures. Evans is recreating as a form of collective procedural memory the processes through which refugees are documented, except that she draws weeping, traumatized faces in each photograph. That is, there are no photographs for Evans to work with. She imagines this is how they would have been photographed. There are no photographs that she can see. She imagines this is how they would have been photographed because the police do not allow her access to the photographs that they have taken. There is one additional feature of this cultural script of trauma. In 3 of her drawn pictures, Evans draws the refugee's head and face, seized and immobilized by the gloved and clearly strong hands of the police. So you have the head being clutched like this by the police. Thus, the pictures become an archive of the refugees, but they also become, whether accurate or not, mimetic approximations of how the photographs may have been taken. There is, as we know, the official documentation, including images of refugees. Evans here nods towards this official archive and memory of the state's perception of the mother and her twins, dehumanizing them, treating them as terrorists, as unwanted people, the famous boat people. These archives are the invisible subtext to what Evans will set out to do with her drawings. She personalizes them without seeking authenticity. They are mimetic approximations, Andre Haxon's term. Evans imagines the trauma of being photographed and commits her imagination to public memory in her book. This serves, I suggest, as a form of counter-memory to the dehumanizing official memory of the police treatment of the woman and her family. In Mary Tomsick's analysis of the visual representation of refugees arriving in Australia, she sees Instagram campaigns as working in stark opposition to the official documentation. So such photographs and drawings in Evans then identify the refugee family as a set of individuals, not as a threatening group. And that's the point I wish to make. What you do is by personalizing them, you refuse to give them the status of a threatening group. People have argued that the way in which you show the refugees collectively grouped together renders them as a threatening group. And people working on the boat people in Australia and others have specifically addressed this. Now, the point I'm making is that in all these cases, the memories are personalized, the trauma is personalized, and it is not possible to not think of how the bodies were exterminated. That is, when looking at the photographs placed after the public history of, say, Cambodia or Vietnam or Hiroshima and their attendant suffering, we become aware of the fact that these faces and persons we see are the ones whose lives are caught up in the traumatic history of their nation. There is another dimension to the photographs in some of these texts. Saida Farhana in Little Women, it's a story from this side, that side, places the photograph of Tara's father at the beginning of the story. The photographs are of people who are dead and therefore function as obituaries without anything else. Sometimes they serve as visual and verbal accompaniments and elaboration. Then the obituary, argues Bridget Fowler, is a means of collective memory, an archive, positioning the dead in a regime of value. Photographs function as personal and familial history and are constitutive as objects of the subjectivity of the displaced. In Kugler's text, many refugee families carry images of the family. They carry it on their phones, they carry physical photographs as well. In Evans's threads, Hoshiar shows his entire family's extended family home and his cats to people, to Evans, her husband and the other volunteers. And this memory and the affective effects is not centered in the human being alone. Rather, an affective speaking human body is not radically different from the affective signaling non-humans with which it coexists. The affective agency of the refugee when he speaks to Evans is a product of an assemblage with the device, phone, story, oral, or the image. It's not centered and restricted to any one of the above, but it appears as an effect of the human, non-human assemblage. My last section has to do with biopolitical governmentality. Refugee vulnerability is part of the theme of biopolitical governmentality. In Illegal, when Ebo and his brother with some friends arrive at Tripoli to await a boat that would get them to Europe, Ebo is ill. Kwame, his brother, is desperate for vacation and determines to get Ebo to hospital. The friend says, if you get into hospital, you can get caught, so you don't go to hospital. There are plenty of references to the dearth of medical care for refugees arriving in European camps, and where the camps themselves are with their poor hygiene, breeding grounds for disease. Now, there are two parts to this. One, refugees are themselves seen as carrying disease. Some of you may know the restrictions, the examinations often very dehumanizing of refugees arriving at Ellis Island in the early part of the 20th century. So one, the refugees are themselves seen as disease people, that they have poor hygiene, they are breeding grounds for disease, and so on and so forth. And then they are themselves subject to diseases. When Riyadh is ill, in this particular text, with a raging fever, he says, what can you do? There is no medicine. Subject to the biopolitical governmentality of the receiving society, the stateless are also denied a membership in the therapeutic economy. They do not, in other words, acquire a therapeutic citizenship, defined as a form of stateless citizenship whereby claims are made on a global order on the basis of one's biomedical condition. Eoin points out that access to treatment is contingent on social relations and the ability to capitalize on social networks. It repeatedly references global movements such as Doctors Without Borders. The stateless do not acquire therapeutic citizenship unless activists such as state events or Doctors Without Borders fit them into moral economy, such as the text. The right to health and medical care characterizes therapeutic citizenship, and it requires local initiatives as well. In Kate Evans's Threats from the Refugee Crisis, 2 pages dealing with the assault on refugees in Calais, France, arrest our attention. The chapter is ironically titled Safe France. 3 Syrian refugees are beaten black and blue, and the point is the street has the drawing shows streets on either side with high walls. They stand grey, hot face, lights are dim, and 3 Syrians are in the foreground. One of them is lying down, they've been beaten, and one's head is crushed. The image play with perspective is achieved by positioning the attackers at the far end of the panel, and therefore of the street. The silhouettes from the street lights are therefore elongated towards the victims. Evans in this image is not solely focusing attention on the incident. He is suggesting an extension of the threats towards the refugees, where the elongated shadows, like in popular Gothic and horror text, appear to be creeping towards the already injured Syrians. Now, given the emphasis of the anonymity of the attackers, the image and the extending shadows, Evans may very well be suggesting that literally anybody could be terrorizing the refugees. Point I'm making is, there is no particular perpetrator of crimes against the refugees except the social order itself. The darkness, the anonymity, and the collusion of the law enforcement authorities that Evans depicts here situates the vulnerability and helplessness of the refugee bodies within a context of a large-scale antagonism of the receiving society towards the refugees. That is, Evans does not indict just the present attackers for the incident, but rather situates the attackers and their victims in a general ethos of distrust, anger, and threat. It is the social order, the setting, and the context that transforms vulnerable refugees into helpless victims and the French public into victimizers themselves. Hello? My friends can. Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, okay, I'm back. Okay, sorry. Sister, I don't know, some small glitch. Okay, so the point I'm making is, in the refugee graphic text, we are not indicting present attackers. Evans does not identify X or Y as a specific attacker of whatever has happened to refugees. Rather, she situates the attackers and victims in the general ethos of distrust and anger in which victims and perpetrators find themselves. What I'm referring to as biopolitical governmentality is a situation where uh, there is a constant refusal of receiving states to offer even minimal therapeutic citizenship. And this refusal, I am arguing, is a form of governance. It governs entire populations. It determines the ways in which a group of Syrian refugees, a group of any kind of refugees, arrive in a particular society and are forced to fend for themselves. So, I'm not going to debate the ethics of receiving populations. That's the job of political scientists to do. Should we receive refugees? How many should we receive? Should there be a determination of the acceptable refugee based on religion, language, whatever? That's not my job. The point I'm making is the governance of the refugee, the systems through which the refugee is received, treated, and controlled. It's a biopolitical regime. And it has to do primarily not just with statelessness, but to do with things like the way they are grouped in camps, the unhygienic conditions, the lack of access to healthcare, medication, the lack of access to food and appropriate nutrition. And in Kate Evans's text, there are references to the many voluntary organizations that actually run trips to these camps to enable them to have food. So the point I'm making is the stateless are denied a membership of the therapeutic economy, and that is a system of biopolitical governmentality. So there is some kind of ethical debate that goes on, of course. Why are we not giving them food? Why are they being denied medication? And things like that, which is the moral economy argument that I pointed to. And there are references to several people dying as a consequence of this particular situation where there is both no food and consequently no medication and lowering of immunity. And some of you may have read in the recent COVID pandemic reports on the state of the refugees that is directly linked to the problem of their being in camps with no access to appropriate and necessary healthcare. So what I'm talking about as biopolitical governmentality is part of a larger moral and therapeutic economy. With that stateless citizenship is also a condition where there is no way that your biomedical condition is attested to, access to treatment being contingent on social relations, and the social relations have denied you any kind of right to access life-saving and life-changing drugs. So in text like The Photographer, which is the story of a photographer who travels with a team of Doctors Without Borders into interior Afghanistan, there are these references to tribes, communities, small populations who wait for the Doctors Without Borders teams to arrive because they have been denied access to healthcare. And it's only because there are Doctors Without Borders that they gain any kind of, let's say, average livable lives. So biopolitical governmentality is a key theme that most of these texts draw to show how vulnerability is transformed into helplessness. They arrive vulnerable, they become helpless. And part of this helplessness is made possible, is contingent upon the the biopolitical governmentality through which the receiving societies welcome them, or welcome being an, of course, awkward word. So what I want to emphasize here is the biopolitical, an old Foucauldian term, is central to how you imagine the refugees, how you construct them, how you campaign for them. And my focus here, I've used just two examples about the medical angle, the therapeutic citizenship angle, has to do with the fact that the human immune system, the human nutrition system are at the mercy of the receiving society's biopolitics. And by denying them food, by denying them adequate nutrition, also in several of those texts, you see refugees living in fragmented, tattered tents, exposed to the elements naturally. So there are several parts to that. So one, they have already arrived tired, sick, dehydrated, starved. They're sent to these camps where there's no health care, no food, compounding their vulnerability. And that compounding of vulnerability is what I'm referring to as helplessness. So I want to conclude with this point that in the case of refugee graphics, the situational vulnerability being heightened into biopolitical governmentality's conditions of helplessness is a key mode of talking about refugees themselves. That you can talk politics, you can talk about the ethics of reception, the arguments over appropriate, what I will refer to as the deserving refugee argument. So the argument being that a woman who has been beaten black and blue on a regular basis because the religion permits the man to behave like that is a deserving refugee, and she will be given citizenship faster than others, as opposed to relatively healthy young men who find it more difficult to get refugee status or asylum status. So the biopolitical governmentality hinges upon and works upon transforming situational vulnerability into conditions of therapeutic non-citizenship, of eroding moral economies, and the biopolitical governmentality of the receiving state. And in all these cases, it is the drawing more than that shows us this transition of moving from vulnerability to helplessness. Thank you.